navigating the changing landscape of cyber insurance. I'm Robert Pignataro, and with me today are subject matter experts in insurance and then the legal aspects of this. And so we really have a great group of people with a lot of expertise. And specifically, speaking towards the legal side will be Chris Dilenno, who's a founding partner of Mullen Coughlin. Mullen Coughlin is probably the premier cybersecurity law firm in the United States. They've won perennial award winner for Cyber Law Firm of the Year, and they handle many of the cases for most of the carriers worldwide. Also with me today is Bob Dietzel, who's the founding principal of KMRD Partners and has extensive background in insurance, especially cyber insurance. And as you'll see, not all insurance policies and not all agents are the same, and you really need to have people who are knowledgeable and supporting you in your endeavors to do this. A few items of housekeeping before we begin is that how the program will work. We're recording it. If you have questions to submit, you could see the meeting chat button on your screen. You could put questions in at any time. We will look to address those at the end of the webinar. And for those of you who question isn't answered or think of one afterwards, please send it in. We'll respond to all people with the list of questions and the answers and information as we move forward. So looking at it, our goals today follow this agenda that you'll see on the next screen, which is what is the landscape, what do you have to do, how do you get there, etc. But before we begin, I'd like to just have everybody think about a couple of questions. All right, the first one is, are you certain your organization will never have a cyber attack? Okay, are you certain your organization will never have a cyber attack? The next one to think about is, would you look forward to explaining to management, your board of directors, stockholders, family members, your bank, why a cyber attack financially crippled your organization? And then the last one would be, would you like to explain why an event like that happened and your cyber insurance policy didn't cover an aspect of that which resulted in a huge loss? Well, if you're like most people, you said no to this. And that's why this presentation is going to be so meaningful, because we're going to go through what can happen, how it can happen, and ways to avoid those three questions becoming a big problem. All right, so let's just take a look at the new reality of cyber insurance. And today, to get coverage and to maintain that coverage for a claim, you really need to have a number of things in place and prove that they're in place. So that whole dynamic has changed tremendously, and you'll hear a lot about that as we move forward with this. Looking at it, there's two things to keep in mind. Who are the key people who are subject to attack, and what's the biggest attack vector? As the next slide shows, the key people in the attack realm, like 98% of all attacks are for small and mid-sized companies. That's like everybody less than the Fortune 100, to say it another way. And why is that? That's because they have the most porous defenses. The big guys have a lot of defenses. You'll hear about those cases because they make the news, but the number of attacks on small and mid-sized enterprises are way off the charts. And we're talking about, these are reported attacks. How many of the attacks are not reported? Or how many of these attacks go on and they cripple a business or cause all kinds of financial problems, and there's no insurance, so it doesn't even make the radar screen. So you need to really look at that. And now we'd like to look at just some of the problems and pressures about cyber insurance. And to lead some of that, we're going to hear from Chris in a minute, but one thing before we get there is, we look at insurance especially, and as this next slide shows, when we think of insurance, we think of fire insurance, and the comparison between fire insurance and cyber, if you look at it, as we get to the next slide here, there's a lot of things that are very comparable. In the case of fire, you assess the risk and exposure, you mandatorily have to write plans and policies, you have to train your people, and you have to implement things to prevent the fire, which includes employee training, evacuate the building, a fire suppression system, sprinkler system, et cetera, and you document all that. Well, you have to do the very same things for cyber. The only big difference is you're much more likely to have a cyber event than you are to have a fire. And so the mindset really, I think most people think, oh, I have a home, I have a building, I have an office, I have a this, I must have fire insurance. Well, more important than even that, given the probability of something happening, is cyber insurance. All right, so to understand a little bit about that, I think we really should start at what happens when you do get hacked. And so Chris Dilenno is now going to give us and walk us through, from his perspective, who he handles these every day, are cases where people have had an event, have had a problem, and he's going to walk us through like kind of the mechanics of what happens and what that it's up to. So Chris, I'd like to see if you could just give us from your perspective some of the things that happen.
Absolutely. Thanks, Robert. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, folks. My name's Chris Dilenno. I'm a partner here at Mullen, Coughlin, and our firm is about 90 attorneys, and we focus on data privacy work, which unfortunately for the world these days is mostly incident response work. We take calls from companies that, to use Robert's analogy, are on fire with a cyber incident of many different forms and shapes, and we become their counsel to help them through it. I'm going to walk through sort of all the moving parts of a cyber incident, and the reason we're starting with a lawyer is because at every turn during the course of an incident, there are legal issues hiding and liabilities that have legal consequences. So what most of the providers of insurance policies out there have are panels of experts to assist their insureds when an incident happens. And the top of the list are the panels of law firms. And they connect you with a law firm first because of the legal pitfalls that exist at every corner. We come in and we become counsel to our clients. So we develop establish a privileged and confidential relationship with our clients so that we can have frank conversations about what's going on, what the situation is, and figure out solutions without opening the door to people coming in and demanding copies of, internal emails and reports and whatnot. We establish that privilege so we can protect the process. But that process obviously is technical. Most of our matters involve some level of technical issues, some sort of hack into a system or vulnerability in a system that has exposed information in that system. So the next vendor that we bring in is a forensic investigator in most incidents. So a forensic investigator, we bring them in on behalf of our clients to protect that investigation best and privilege. Again, once we're through this, we may have to notify folks and report out about the incident. So we're going to be opening the door to people looking in and asking questions. We want to be able to say, here's the answers. We want to give full answers to people, but we don't want to hand over reports from our forensic investigator. So we protect that in privilege to best control the information that will be shared. But the forensic guys have a huge job. They have to come in, immediately try to contain an incident. In many cases, there are open vulnerabilities that are occurring that are discovered, and once they're discovered, doesn't mean that you clearly know the threat actor is not out of the system. So they're immediately helping to assess whether or not the breach is ongoing or has been contained. They're gathering evidence so that they can figure out how it happened, what the scope of it was, how many systems were impacted, and then eventually what data on those systems was compromised or exposed in some way. Was it stolen? Was it actually copied off the system? And we'll get into some specifics. Many of our matters are ransomware matters, and they are just sort of, I'd say about 40% of our matters are involve ransomware attackers, and they are sort of the monster of cyber events because they have all the moving parts in one. You have the technical issues of a system being shut down, of a hacker in the system, and then you have, because they're in the system, the exposure of data. So you are full bore trying to work multiple work streams at the same time. So our forensic investigators have a lot of different skills. They can assist with restoration of systems. They can assist with the forensics, of course, and the evidence analysis. And then with ransomware, we get assistance with negotiating with threat actors out there. So all of that's going on. And in the meantime, your system is, your business is shut down potentially. So you are thinking about customers asking, hey, why can't I get business done today? Or just vendors and partners wondering what's going on with the system. You immediately need to develop some messaging. So the next vendor that we bring in is public relations. So we're also working with them to develop the right way to say things. And, you know, I can say in an incident, there is an urge to be forthright and open with your valued customers. You want to tell them, hey, you know, this is we've been attacked and we are working as hard as we can to get things figured out. But you really need to control what you say and when you say it and how you say it. You only want to provide information that answers the questions, but only if you need to, because the minute you say something, it's going to generate the next question. It's going to generate more requests. So you want to be able to say whatever you need to say to keep people understanding that you have the situation under control, you're working with experts, and you are going to keep them posted. But you don't want to tell them, we've been hacked, we think there's been a breach, we are going to be reporting this to the Attorney General, and we are going to be providing credit monitoring. You don't want to talk about all these things that you don't know yet really if they apply yet. So you need to investigate, you need to get your hands around the situation before you really start talking about it, while at the same time saying enough to make people realize that you do have things under control. So then you go through the process of containing the event and investigating, and you discover that all of your employee names and social security numbers were hacked out of the HR folder in your system. Or you have customer information that includes social security numbers, driver's license numbers, check numbers, credit card numbers, those kinds of things. All of that has been potentially compromised. So you now need to figure out as soon as you can, because there are clocks ticking. All the statutes out there that protect this type of data, there are 50 of them, one for each state and various other territories. Federally, you have HIPAA, you have Gramm-Leach-Bliley. These are mandating certain steps be taken once there's been a compromise of certain protected data. And that's where the legal issue comes in. A lot of people think a breach, you know, it is a layman's term, meaning somebody got into your system. But a breach to me is a specifically defined legal term. It's a unauthorized access or use of protected information that compromises the security of that information. So if protected information isn't involved, even though someone unauthorized accessed your system, it doesn't mean that there's a breach because it didn't access personally identifiable information. Or maybe you can show that the unauthorized access that appeared to be the case when you first investigated the incident, turns out it wasn't unauthorized, that it was somebody using a new system while on vacation in France. And so it looked suspicious, but it actually wasn't. So you need to investigate it before you say the term breach. And we try not to say it really ever if we don't have to. We want to make people, somebody, you know, understand what the facts are and evaluate for themselves. So if there is a component of notice, there are vendors on the insurance panels for providing the printing and the mailing of notice letters. They set up call centers for answering the questions. If you send out 10,000 letters saying, hey, your social security number was exposed, you're going to get hundreds of calls asking for more information. So we set up call centers to make sure they can get those frontline questions answered. And then credit monitoring. There are a number of states that require credit monitoring by statute if you have an exposure of, in particular, social security numbers and driver's license numbers. So we are often setting up enrollment for thousands of people to access credit monitoring for a period of time. This is 1 year, 2 year. And now the news is out. You've now announced the incident as you were legally required to do. You also have to tell certain state attorneys general by statute. And in the case of a HIPAA protected entity under HIPAA, you have to tell Health and Human Services. So you're telling them, hey, we were hacked, or we had a security incident, and we had to notify these 10,000 people about their names and social security numbers exposed, and here's what we did to make sure we're secure. And then you get questions from them as well. So that's the aftermath of a big notice, is a lot of questions to answer, and they can spawn formal regulatory investigations and then litigation. Of course, you'd be surprised that most of our incidents don't end up in litigation. You handle these matters as quickly and as efficiently as you can, and people don't generally sue you for any kind of damage, and that's because it's hard to link any actual damage to an incident. A hacker steals names and social security numbers. They may not use them for years. So in the aftermath of an incident, many times people don't have any particular damage from the incident, and you're providing credit monitoring in many cases. So there's really nothing that we can give them or do for them. And there's just not a lot of litigation. But once you have a matter involving 100,000 people or millions of people, you can almost guarantee there's going to be a class action lawsuit. So it isn't getting smaller. I'd say maybe 4 or 5% of our cases, and we saw over 3,000 last year. Maybe 4 or 5% end up in litigation, but it's not going down. It's probably going to be going up, because I do think the plaintiff attorneys out there are getting more and more adept at framing these complaints and organizing these class actions. So it is a big certainly a big expense. And going back on what we've talked about here, you have legal experts, IT experts, print mail, notification, credit monitoring experts, you have public relations, and then you have the third party investigations and litigation. These pile up. And looking at this slide, the costs, it really depends on a lot of the facts. Every matter's got its own nuances to it, and there are extremely wide ranges in costs here. But at the very least, you're going to be looking at legal and likely forensic and likely notification costs. This is tens of thousands of dollars, if not $100,000 at a minimum. It's sort of, once you pass go on an incident, you're spending tens of thousands of dollars for sure. Every once in a while we get a matter that's 10 people affected and we don't need to investigate it. These things do get addressed in a much smaller way, but generally speaking, they're tens of thousands of dollars, and in many cases, they're hundreds of thousands of dollars. And when you're talking about ransomware, the ransom demand itself ranges from $200,000 to start to $15 million. I mean, I've had a client with a $15 million demand. They are something that you can negotiate. This poor client, their backups were encrypted in some cases and deleted in others, so they had no way to get their system back up and running. And so we were negotiating, and you end up paying a multi-million-dollar ransom. That's just one cost in the pile here. So then there's, this talks about the iceberg effect. If you're shut down for 2 weeks, you have business interruption, you have reputational loss, customers may not come back, you have employees that you're paying while they're doing nothing because the system isn't working, and maybe employees losing some sort of confidence in the company because it can take weeks to get things back to normal, and employees can leave. So there are sort of tail end costs that you don't think about necessarily that certainly are a reason to treat this very seriously and try to avoid one of these events in the first place as much as possible. But Robert was absolutely right when asking the question, do you think you're never going to be hit? Nobody should think that. It's happening every day, all over the place, to every kind of organization out there. in different ways, and there's always inevitably a cost. It's important to understand this and to get insurance in place, because you're not left alone. There is great insurance out there that covers all these aspects and can really be a resource for you to avoid it. Just thinking through getting the insurance forces you to think about the state of your security and the operations and policies that you have in place. So addressing this in a holistic way of really fortifying your company with security and insurance is going to save you, in many ways down the road. Maybe this is a perfect time for me to hand it over to Bob Dietzel, and you can talk more about the insurance.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I think, Chris, on the preceding slide, number 9 there, Karen, if you could pull that up, is I think just a capsulization of a lot of what Chris talked about, average cost for ransomware. And as you can see, all the things he's talking, they really add up. But that's really, thanks for that, Chris. It's really eye-opening. So now that we've kind of laid bare, here's the bottom line of all the problems, Bob Dietzel is going to speak to, a lot of the basics of insurance and things he sees from his area of expertise.
Thank you. Really nice to be here. You'll see on this screen the statistic that was presented earlier by Robert. 98% of the companies are small to middle market companies, but the other troublesome percentages are when executives were interviewed, 28% claim that they have experienced some type of data breach in the last year. 64% anticipate that unauthorized users will attempt to access their systems. So if you had a 64% chance of buying fire insurance, you'd feel a little bit better about paying that premium, wouldn't you? But if you're not looking at your cyber liability from an insurance perspective, these days, you're really making a big mistake. The other interesting statistic is coverage. 65% of those executives interviewed had cyber policies, so that's lower than the percent I'm sure that buy fire. And 64% of those respondents that bought coverage actually understand what's inside of the policy. Chris mentioned a lot of exposures in a lot of different categories and a lot of vendors. I couldn't, think about, 5 or 6 different types of vendors that all cost an exorbitant amount of money. Next slide. So what are the most common insurance issues today? Let's talk about that. Today, the insurance market, if you're reading the paper, you'll understand that the insurance market is bleeding at the moment. They underpriced insurance policies. We kind of knew that years ago when they were selling the product, and to a great extent, it was a very inexpensive policy. We thought they were naive. Then the claims started rolling in. People have heard of Home Depot. They've heard of large organizations getting hit. And today, the market is in a state of crisis. It is really the hardest insurance market I've seen in my 30 years in business. For example, we're seeing quotes with literally half the coverage in the form of co-insurance. You're now 50% co-insurance, so you're on the hook for 50 cents of every dollar spent of a claim. But congratulations, you get to spend double the price to access that coverage. And that's what we're seeing right now. The other thing that we're seeing is that carriers are looking at the exposures, or their perceived exposures of their clients, and they're sublimiting these issues, forensics, credit monitoring. They're invoking 10,000 record deductibles if you're in the retail space. They're also putting mandatory controls that have to be in place. So when you fill out that cyber application, you'll see what those mandatory controls. We see Very few carriers today, as an example, will even quote a piece of business if you don't have multi-factor authentication throughout your system. Not just on the front side, not just on the back side, not just on one program that you utilize in your system. They want to see it throughout your systems. Very important. Next slide.
And one thing, Bob, too, a lot of times I think we think, like, I call up my agent and I say, I need fire insurance, and it gives me a couple of quotes from a couple of carriers.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, if you do the same thing in cyber, isn't it very different because cyber, every carrier kind of has a different flavor rather than a standardized form? I don't know if I'm saying that the right, you know what I mean? It's like, one's been around for a long time, and the other is kind of like everybody's still adjusting.
You're absolutely right. Every carrier has a different approach. They have a different type of appetite. Some carriers don't want to be in the retail business. Mm-hmm. Some carriers are discriminatory on what type of ransomware, what type of firewall you're using, what type of screening systems that you're using. They're all very, very different, and the insurance policies are vastly different. Very much like professional liability or directors and officers liability, there is no standard coverage form. You have to take a look at, you have to understand your risk. So Chris laid out all the expenses. You have your attorney, you have your forensics, you have your credit monitoring, you have your liability, you have the ransom demands, those type of things. Each one of those categories can have a different approach to triggering that coverage and a different approach to sublimiting the coverage to a lower limit. So, for example, what we say when you're trying to design an insurance program in all cases, first is understand your risk. We talked a lot today about most companies are worried about losing customer records, Home Depot, That's not necessarily the case. The risk may be that you're exchanging data back and forth with your clients and or vendors that may be of some value, some intellectual property value. If you're dealing with a customer that is having electronic data interface is very popular now from a systems perspective. So you're actually accessing your customer systems to communicate with them, to invoice them, and that vulnerability can occur at your operation, but the vulnerability is actually, they're targeting Home Depot,
sure,
as or the large company down the street. So that large company may have customer records inside their system, but if you create the vulnerability by working with them, that's a problem.
Well, and a lot of things we see from our perspective, too, is when there is an issue, a lot of times the company finds out for the first time, like, it's probably a bad analogy, but something like, well, I have hurricane insurance, but I don't have coverage for the damage that the rising water did in my hurricane policy. And unfortunately, we've seen a number of cases where somebody will have an issue, have a claim, and then lo and behold, they're not covered for this or they're not covered for that. I mean, and certain companies, two companies in the same industry, like one thing is some companies wire transfer money to pay bills. Others pay directly by other means. And, it's not a big cost increase in the terms of a policy to get that coverage for something that can really cripple a company or to get some of the other things. So I'm glad you take such a deep, involved look at it, because quite frankly, a lot of times that's where problems occur. It's not studies from Ernst & Young and others that show that many of the policies are not aligned with the risk that the companies face or the exposures. And your expertise and methodology is really what's needed.
Yeah, let's face it, the insurance companies are in the business of making money. And if you want to understand what the insurance companies are worried about, you look to the policies. You look to the exclusionary language inside of the policies. If there's a HIPAA exclusion and you're dealing in the healthcare industry, the insurance company may not be comfortable with that. So where should you invest your time?
Right.
Shutting that down, doing the training, mitigating the loss. However, most customers, like I said, 65% of the people that buy insurance, these policies, don't understand what's inside them. because they're not thoughtfully looking to the provisions inside of the policy. Is that a risk?
Right.
Is the FSMA a risk? Is Graham Reach violate? HIPAA? These are the things we're worried about. Let's start with the exposure, then design the policy accordingly. Some of it may not be insurable or too expensive to insure, but at least you know.
Right. Okay, good stuff.
So we've talked a little bit about this already. We are seeing a lot of non-renewals. We've for the first time in my career over the past year, we've had a few customers that were uninsurable because they hadn't invested in their systems or done their patches over the years, and it became too cost intensive. So they become uninsurable, which is from an insurance broker, that's our worst nightmare because it never ever happens. There's always somebody out there to take the risk. In this market, it's not the case. Claims are being denied too because of what's said on the application. People aren't just, you have a simple yes or no answer. Do you have multi-factor authentication? Yes. Well, I do because I have it on one of my programs. All my critical information is over here, and it's accessible without it. But those yes and no questions are traps, and carriers are using those traps to deny coverage. They're alleging misrepresentation inside of these claims. I think Chris was telling us the other day that he's had several cases that occurred.
Well,
yeah.
Okay, so then
it's a bad time to learn how your system works, I think, and I don't know if it's necessarily a trap. I think the carriers really want to make sure that they know what they're getting when they insure a risk, and I think a lot of people out there just aren't thorough in understanding what they're saying when they answer these questions, and it's a terrible time to find out after you've been hit with an incident.
Yep.
Well, and to that point, more and more, like when we look at, which we've looked at a number of the applications, it's really a startling difference to see from several years ago where they just asked like 2 or 3 questions, revenue, number of employees, et cetera. Like now, there's many, many questions, and they've really identified a number of IT cyber defense mechanisms that you need to have in place. And they not only want to know, A, you have it and you check a box, but they want to know the vendor. Like, tell me you're doing it and show me who's doing it for you. And then, of course, as you were saying, when you have a claim, as Chris was saying, you really need to be able to say, I can prove I've had it supported or had it in place.
A lot of customers have emergency action plans and they have disaster recovery plans. Cyber has to be part of that.
Yes.
Now, so you have to know. The next slide actually brings that that up. These are the typical insurance carrier IT requirements.
Yeah, so these are the things that, when you fill out an application today, you need to check the box that you have it, and you need to indicate that it's in place, who put it in place, and who's maintaining it. And really, we see from many perspectives that probably the first 13 or 14 of those are required in almost every case. So this is not a list where, 1 to 3 is this carrier. Almost every carrier is requiring at a minimum, the first 13 or 14 of those items on all these applications.
Absolutely, and if you don't know that whether or not you have those items, you probably don't. Or your IT professional is not communicating with you effectively because those folks speak a different language, as everybody knows. You need to have them communicate in the language you understand so you can assist you in working with your broker and building the story to the marketplace that you're implementing best practices. So if you have the first 13, oh great, you have a ticket to the dance, right? But if you want to get on the dance floor and you want to get better coverage, less pricing, you look at more sophisticated approaches such as vulnerability assessment, penetration testing, segregated backups, understanding your risk.
Okay, well that's good. And so we've heard a lot about what happens when the what hits the fan and things to do to put in place. Now let's talk a little bit about how do I put in place some of these things. And that's really a lot of what Ultimate Risk Services is about. It's kind of bringing to bear ways to make cyber simple, okay? And we're just going to run through what we've got that helps in this regard. And I would say this, whether it's the IT, in any state of this, like your legal representative or counsel, your insurance agent, any IT people you really need to know that they know what they're doing. There's a lot of people, I'll say this as gently, there's a lot of people in this arena who don't know and profess to know. Now, Bill White, who's our chief internet specialist and expert, our CISO, has really been instrumental in putting together and showing us what pieces need to be in there to form a foundation, to help people get a basic program and understand the integration of all these things. And he'll be part of the Q&A if people have questions. But basically, it starts with us. There's 5 steps to every program, and this is risk mitigation, whether it's cyber or anything else, workplace safety, yada, yada. You evaluate what your risks are, and then you put in place policies and procedures. Those policies and procedures spell out what you're supposed to do. Then you do training, because you have to train your people as to what's in the policies and procedures, which mitigates the risk. You then need to monitor that you completed the tasks that are outlined in the policies or to mitigate risk, and remind yourself if you're not doing that. And why is all that required and necessary? Well, because you really need to put some things in place and understanding you can never avoid the injury, the accident, the hack, or the fire. That's why you have insurance. In this case, it's cyber. And a key part of getting all that together is IT and technology. And over the next several slides, we're going to look to the things that are involved in a approach that we've developed, which is called an insurance compliance subscription. So the next slide really starts to show that. And it starts with the plans and policies. Ours were co-developed with Mullen Coughlin. With their expertise, they've added to the IT and regulatory parts and augmented that with the legal aspects. And these plans, moreover, don't just address those areas, but for changes and updates, they're monitored, and when updates occur as part of our ongoing subscriptions, the updates are included in the plans. We include a library that addresses PCI, HIPAA, phishing, general security, the GLBA and other standards, and that's all included. You get a resource center, which we'll look to in a little bit, and especially a system that reminds you with dashboards that you've done or haven't done something or need to do something by a deadline. We had mentioned earlier that if you have, let's say, PCI, you have credit cards. Well, a number of requirements are that you do vulnerability assessments every quarter. If you don't do that and have a claim, the carrier can deny the entire claim. Yep. This system notifies you, hey, it's coming up, it's due, and it turns red if it's overdue. You get a help desk, and you get an insurance review from someone like KMRD, or we give guidelines at a minimum as to what should be included in that. Well, pricing-wise, this next slide shows you what this basic system goes for. And as you can see, it's pretty cost-effective. And that's really our goal, is to make things that are simple, affordable, and scalable. And for $1,200 a year, you get up to 25 users. Those could be employees, right? Above that, it's $4 per user per month. So it's a very simple, affordable system. The IT section, which is addressed on the next slide, includes all those other things that now, I think there's 10 of them there, and the ones that we have in our subscription are 3. So to cover the first 13 items, which are most always required by every carrier, there's a one-time cost per user of $135 and $65 per user per month. Now, we use vetted managed service providers who are experienced and do this routinely with all kinds of credentials every day. They are the ones that provide this bundle of services, which is important and vital because all of you on your applications are going to have to list who's doing what. All right, so some of the other items that Bob had mentioned, like is on the next slide, segregated backups, those all are very variable from company to company, but can be quoted. Again, everybody should use vetted, professional people and quality folks who can do this. Now, there is a link in this program, and we'll give it to you. I don't know what slide, Karen, that was on, to our Cyber Resource Center. Oh, there it is. If anyone clicks on this, what that'll take you to is our Cyber Resource Center. As its name implies, this was developed to provide people with information. You could go to that, you could go to the insurance or any other tab and look up the Buy Now button. Just click on that, and what you can do is you can do a evaluation of what a program for your company with your specifics would cost. You don't have to fill out all the other information, but you could use it as a tool to give you an idea as to what it might cost for the subscription and some of the other IT things. And I will say this, all this, we want to really give credit where credit's due to Bill White, who really was the architect for helping us design this. From his many years of being in the industry and facing at the front lines all these issues, he kind of brought us back to say, what so often is missing is the fundamental foundation. Many of these programs run into problems because they have this and that done by different people, but none of them have a really sound foundation to build their cybersecurity, hygiene, and safety programs on. So I'd just like to really stress that. And now I think we're at the point where we're ready for some of the questions. If we have them, I'd like to get Skelly involved if she has any. And remember, if you don't hear yours, send it in, we'll answer it, and we send that back to all attendees.
Yeah, so I want to let folks know, if you've got a question, there's a high likelihood someone else has the same question. This is a complex topic. It's a constantly evolving landscape. So don't be shy about your questions. Bob, while we're waiting for things to come in on the Q&A, you've talked about insurance. We all know insurance is great. The more you spend, the better. So can you help us understand, how do I figure out how much I need?
Oh, that's a really difficult question to answer, I must say. And it's not necessarily one that's just for your broker. If you do have a law firm with Chris's expertise, you would consult with them. Obviously, a lot has to do with what information you're trying to protect. If you're a large retailer and you're taking credit card transactions, you've seen a lot of claims. If you're a municipality, you saw the city of Baltimore was hit for a giant number because they have all the information of their constituents inside of their system. So how big can this claim be from a number? Then, from a liability perspective, you have intellectual property. Are you a design firm that works with folks that patent their designs, that are trying to protect them? And a breach could just decimate your company. So you can't buy enough. It's like umbrella liability. How big? It's like when you're buying what are you going to hit with your car? Depends on how much insurance you need. What we do recommend is a minimum of about $1 million. If only just to get the expertise in place, to start the conversation of where your exposures are, and when if and when there's a breach, the carrier will reach out to a firm like Chris's. They're on a lot of panels inside of the firms. They'll pay for their services. Forensic firms are not easy to find, especially when you have customized software. So they can get you started and make sure that you meet those state requirements, because they're now in there with you, helping you manage that claim. So get at least $1 million, get the policy in place.
Also with that, I think a lot of things that a lot of us who don't know any better about the ins and outs of will imagine, and I don't know if that's correct, but for me, I may need, or it might be suggested that to my base policy I add a certain kind of coverage. Let's say for somebody taking the money out of my bank account, or duping my people to wiring the money. And that extra coverage doesn't necessarily multiply the premium per se. A lot of times it's surprised to find out it doesn't really necessarily, in the scheme of things, add all that much. But what you said I think is important, because then I can know that for this extra amount of dollars I can cover that. Then I, as a business person, with my advisors, can evaluate, well, is that worth the extra $800, or, not that that's always the number, or X.
Right. So you brought up a great issue, those fishing expeditions that are so popular these days. We're seeing more claims of theft of money utilizing computerized systems, utilizing these phishing techniques. Hey, change my wiring instructions. Can you send the payroll here now? Happens quite a bit. That, believe it or not, is not just covered on a cyber policy. That's a commercial crime policy with computer fraud coverage. So we see a lot of customers saying, we need cyber, and we need business interruption coverage also with that, because we're going to lose income if we're down. And, you know, we have phishing expertise, we're going to lose the payroll account. But it's not always one policy. And then we see a lot of people buying duplicate coverage at times, which creates a fist fight amongst the carriers in the event of a big claim. So your broker has to know enough to understand the scenarios, the risks, but also explain to you where in the policies it's covered. Not just a yes and no, it's covered.
Yes.
Show them, get them educated.
And I hope one of the messages folks are hearing is you can use an incremental approach. This seems huge. We don't need to eat the elephant all at once. So a lot of what we are trying to talk about today is how do we get started? But I am going to pivot, Chris, and ask you a question. I get a breach. You talked about most of your work being incident response. I get the breach. What do I do? What are the first three things that I do?
Absolutely, yeah. Well, we're called breach coach for a number of the insurance carrier panels, and essentially that means we are the first responders on the other end of a hotline number provided. It goes to our team. We're immediately 10 people are jumping and figuring out how to get on the phone with the affected entity and figure out what exactly is going on. So really important at the beginning is to get in touch with the right folks. And so if you have an insurance policy, in parallel or first, before you call anybody, you make sure the insurance carrier knows about it, because these things pile up costs quickly, and you need to keep the insurance carrier in the loop from the very beginning so that they can make sure that you understand how the coverage works. And the insurance carriers are the ones with the panel, so they can connect you with the right folks immediately. So if you have an insurance policy, you call the hotline provided by the insurance company, and they will connect you almost certainly with legal counsel very quickly. And that's when we start to really organize all the resources, IT forensics, maybe some messaging in the beginning. We're making sure we're addressing all of the issues that are occurring as quickly as they need to be. So the first thing you do, you want to contact your broker, the insurance carrier, and then through them contact the law firm breach coach, and they will be able to coordinate the real practical steps that you need to take with regard to IT steps and any kind of messaging and other reporting that's coming following an event.
I can't stress enough, Chris, we talked about this earlier the other day, how important it is for the attorney to understand the conditions inside the policy in the event of a claim. Because what you do and what your law firm does after you discover a breach could void coverage. So there are can be some onerous conditions that Chris's firm's familiar with, but you definitely have to refer to the policy before you act.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great call out, because the insurance policies, a lot of times they have panel vendors for all of these things, and the insurance policy requires you to use a panel vendor in many cases. So a lot of people will quickly call for their known forensic vendor to help start investigating and handle the IT aspects of an incident before they call their broker, their carrier, and the lawyer. And the IT vendor's getting in there. Maybe they're restoring systems so they work, but they're deleting evidence. And then you call your carrier. Your carrier says, "Look, I'm glad you did something, but we don't cover costs from vendors that aren't on our panel, so that all those costs aren't covered." And then you find out that you had a duty to preserve basic evidence in order for them to cover next steps that are going to follow, and that evidence is gone. So it really is important to contact the insurance carrier when you're experiencing one of these events.
And what a lot of clients and people don't understand, carriers don't understand, is that's all negotiable. If you have a preferred vendor, a preferred breach coach, a preferred forensics firm, your broker should bring that up to the carrier up front tell you whether or not they're on the panel before you buy the policy, before the claim, because you don't want it to be a surprise. And if they're not, that's often an opportunity for that firm to potentially become a panel member, so that your broker can introduce them to the carrier in an attempt to make a change in the policy conditions.
No, and that's a good point. Avoiding surprises, I think, is really something. I know and part of the reason we included it is we include in our program, all our subscriptions, a free 24/7 hotline to Mullen Coughlin, where anybody can call up with a question or an issue and get a knowledgeable attorney helping them with information. And that just doesn't apply to, I think I've had this event, but more and more you're seeing in vendor contracts, which a lot of people aren't looking at, all these provisions of mandatory maintenance as part of that contract of insurance, co-insurance, and all these cyber requirements. You're seeing that in bank and in lending issues, and a lot of people don't really address it. You see it as part of a contract that you have to maintain certain things or do certain things. And so we have a whole series of experts with Mullen Coughlin that anybody can avail themselves of that's part of that program. And that's very helpful because a lot to what you're saying and Chris is saying is that avoids a surprise. Now I know, hey, at least there's some things out here that can bite me and I should look out for them. Yeah. Other than that, I don't really know. And as much detail as there is in this, that's really something I think that a lot of people could have a lot of help on.
And that's why this product was attractive to us initially when you introduced it to us, because as a broker, we want to be able to tell the story. The more you document the information that you have in your system, the first step of your program, the better we are able to represent you in the marketplace, meaning the information is there and it's in an organized format and it addresses all the key issues the carriers are looking for.
Yeah.
So that opens up the market.
Yeah, and what we see in today's world is not just about, I need to put the 17 things in place for insurance, but you'll see that in the Graham-Leachy amendments for anybody taking credit type of information. Those same 17 things have to be there at a minimum. If you're doing any type of government contracting for DoD or in aerospace, as a company working for a big company, you have to be able to prove starting next May that you have, at a minimum, those 17 things and then some in place. So it's really spreading. Vendor contracts, same thing. You see it again and again and again, and it's almost like there's at least a list of 17, and then depending upon the regulation or the rule or the vendor, the add-on requirements. So
I think we've got time for maybe 2 more questions. I've got one for Bill White, our CISO. Before I ask Bill that question, I am going to have a question for the whole panel, which is, what is the question that people don't ask that they should ask? So I'll give you guys a minute or 2 to think about that. What is the question folks don't ask but they should ask? In the meantime, we've got Bill White here. He's our CISO. We have focused a lot on insurance and some different things. Billy, what else should we cover? You've got the unique technical perspective. What would you like to share with the folks on the phone?
Well, a couple things, and believe it or not, one of the things I would like to share the most really isn't technical. I think a lot of companies think that cybersecurity and protecting their assets is a technology problem only, and it's not. I would like to stress, just based on what Bob and Chris had said earlier, the reliance on a well-versed, reliable legal team in your court, because just as an example, you may be familiar with OFAC, which is the Office of Foreign Asset Control. And these folks maintain a list of some very special people and governments and bad guys. And basically, if somebody shows up on this list and those folks attack you, and you have to pay a ransom, and you pay that ransom thinking that you're doing the right thing, you might wind up being fined civil penalties or criminal penalties because you're paying off some folks that are on a list that says do not pay. So it's really important to have that legal expertise, and even with your insurance folks, that the insurance expertise to step in and say, okay, you've got all these things in place, you're doing your best to mitigate the risks, but in reality, when you do get dinged, especially with ransomware, you might want to get back up and running very quickly, and you might be doing pulling the backups that you have because you're supposed to have backups. You might be pulling the forensic team in because you're supposed to do that. So you might have all these technology pieces in place, but you're going to wind up paying out of pocket because the insurance company's not going to cover that ransom. And you're also going to get, like I said, dinged with some penalties and fines. So that's a big thing I like to mention. Again, you asked me about technology, but in reality, it's a lot more than just technology. But what I would say is what we were building on earlier, that list that we had up of about 10 to 12 items on what the insurance companies are looking for. You've got things like segregated backups, network segmentation, multi-factor authentication is huge. They all play a role and they all work together to help protect you. So that's very important. But please know that oftentimes when you're going just for, we're checking boxes for insurance here because it's so important, but you really do need a full-blown cybersecurity program that's based on best practices, not just for insurance or not just for PCI or not just for HIPAA. You need to take a holistic approach, and as alluded to before, I think we do that at URS, and a lot of our partners take that same approach where we're going to help you get into an insurance policy that fits you right, but we're also going to educate you on what it takes to really build a cybersecurity program from the ground up. I think that's really important. I think that's a take-home point, is that yes, we can give you a checklist on what you need to do to get your insurance and be PCI compliant, but there's a lot more to it than that.
Excellent, Billy. Thank you so much. All right, this is a lightning round, so we're going to start with Robert. A question people should ask that they don't ask.
I would think that is, what's the best way for me to get started? I think a lot of people look at this and think, oh my goodness, I don't even know where to begin. So I think that the question starts like with, okay, what am I exposed to? And really it's a risk mitigation program. And typical of a risk mitigation program, there's kind of like three factors. How do I determine what my exposures are, and then limit the frequency, exposure, and duration of that? And so I can't ever put in place enough of things so I'll never get hacked. So I want to affordably put in place as many of the things that Billy just spoke to in a holistic best practices arena that I can, and then get insurance to assist me in the balance, realizing that, like many people say, it's not a matter of if, but when. And so I think the key question is, like, where do I start? Or where should I start?
Excellent. Chris, I'm going to pass that question to you, and then we will go to Billy, and we'll end with Bob.
I think a question a lot of people don't ask is, if once you're all secure, you feel like you understand your cyber risk management, you have to ask, are my vendors and partners secure? Everybody has partners that they share data with, that they get data from, and they can be the weak link in the whole program. It's still your data. If you share data, like employee payroll may be handled by, or your CPA may handle sensitive data related to your business. They have an incident. It's your incident because it's your data. So you have to ask all these same questions of your vendors is, I think, something people should be aware of.
That's a good one, Chris. There are lots of nodding heads here.
Mm-hmm.
Billy.
Yes. I have a couple of questions that I think should be asked. And one is does the insurer offer different types of policies? That would be an example. If they do, what are the deductibles? Can the policies be customized? Would be an example as well. Are you looking for a standalone policy or a supplemental policy? So there's some basic questions that should be covered. Also, what types of events are covered? Are we looking at first, third-party coverage? Are we looking at ransomware, phishing, social engineering? So kind of digging down deep on what's actually covered, what kind of cost can you use to recover? So there's a bunch of different things, and I could probably put together a list if somebody's interested on what I personally think should be asked, but really that's about it. And I think Chris might have mentioned it a little bit earlier today about what steps do you have to take after the breach occurs or after the incident occurs. That's important as well. So you need to know those ahead of time, and please get those in your incident response plan. You don't want to sit around saying, okay, we've got a breach. Are we supposed to call the insurance attorney first or our attorney first? Are we supposed to do the forensics first? Are we supposed to delete things? Are we supposed to take a bit-by-bit copy of the hard drive? So there's a lot of questions that need to be asked ahead of time regarding that response that should be in your IRP plan. It's super, super important. I see a lot of people getting burned by that, and that can hurt. And then I would just say also, not to take up too much time, just ask about any other restrictions or exclusions that might apply that you might not be aware of that stand out.
Excellent. Thank you so much. All right, Bob, take us home.
Bill, you took all my questions.
I'm sorry.
No, my question's pretty simple, and I love it when our customers ask it. When the broker is done or your insurance representative is done explaining to you what is covered, ask them what's not covered. Because that's the most important thing you should understand.
Yes.
You should focus your risk mitigation efforts there, because you're transferring the risk potentially on those issues that are covered. Obviously, you want to cover the issues that are your risks, but what's not covered by the policy? If the broker's not excited about talking to you about that, you should get a second opinion.
Well said. Yeah, because I think so often we're not paying attention to, like, what am I vulnerable to? Like, what's still there?
Right.
Gotcha.
Because what they're worried about, what the insurance company's worried about, is what you should worry about.
Yeah. Well, okay, well, listen, that's about it. Anybody whose questions haven't been answered, again, please, there's information how to contact each of us individually or collectively. Just send it in, the information, and we will respond to any and all questions and send them to the entire group. So thank you all for your time and participation, and we're here, and no cost to call and find out some information. Thank you all now.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.